My name is Ernest Wilson. I was born May 3rd in 1948 in Washington, D.C. That makes me 74, 70,
Yeah.
I think 74, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I live in Los Angeles now. What else did you?
That's it.
Is that
That's
it?
all.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. So what I'd like to hear about now is where did you grow up? What was that like? And maybe as you tell us that, at some point I'd like to ask you to talk about your grandparents and all of that. So.
Okay. Well, growing up, when I did, I grew up in the last years of segregation in Washington, D.C., which was a segregated southern town when I was growing up there. And the high schools and junior high schools were mostly segregated, but not entirely. I grew up in a middle-class family in Washington, and I grew up on the campus of Howard University, which, as you know, is one of the largest and most renowned, I think, historically black colleges and university. My father was an administrator there. He was the director of international student services. So our family spent a lot of time interacting with young people from all over the world, especially from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, etc. I had, at that time, I had a younger sister who's 4 years younger than I. And we grew up, as I said, on Howard University's campus.
How many siblings?
I have two. I have a brother who I think you'll be talking to
Yes.
on Saturday, and a sister who is also a professor, and she is at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. So both my brother and my sister are writers and continue to be engaged in the life of the mind. And we've remained in pretty good contact. And I think that this engagement with the life of the mind is something that is historical within our family. I mentioned earlier that I was writing a memoir. And one of the things that I've come across recently is that one of my cousins did a video of her father, whose name was Billy Wilson. And Billy Wilson grew up in Philadelphia. He was my father's youngest brother, youngest sibling. And he started off dancing kind of classical dance in Philadelphia. Then he left there and went off to Europe and signed up and somehow was selected to be a primo ballerina with the Netherlands Ballet Company, and did that for a number of years, and then came back to got married one of the prima ballerinas, and they performed across Europe.
Dutch?
Dutch. And he led a very interesting life. I was reading some things about him, and his daughter just did a video that described his professional career. And he was one of the writers and choreographers for a show on Broadway called Bubbling Brown Sugar that he taught and directed, rather, and was in with Lena Horne in a show called Jamaica, and was in, and choreographed and wrote 3 or 4 other Broadway shows, and did TV work and so forth. So he was quite a character. And what I've took away from reading more about him and thinking about other parts of my family is that we are, in our family, we have people who are odd. And I say that to say that these are people who were willing to combine different elements to produce different results. So Billy Wilson was able to combine classical ballet, at which he excelled, as well as combine that with sort of working class, rural music that he heard when he would go to church. So he would hear these women singing these songs, these traditional black religious songs, and not only singing but dancing around the church. And when it would get cold, they would light the fire. But they never got so hot that they would get too close to the fire and burn themselves. And so he said that was wonderful, because what that showed him is that it's possible to be possessed by a religious fervor, but also disciplined enough so that you don't get burned on the side. And so he spent much of his life combining traditional African American art, gospel music mostly, and dancing and singing with European art. And so at one point he was, when I was at Harvard, he was the director for a show that's put on at Harvard every year called The Hasty Pudding, which is a show that's done by the senior guys at Harvard. Wow. So that's one element which I captured, but the other thing that struck me at the time is that on the other side of the family, so he's my father's youngest brother, my grandmother, my mother's mother, was also an artist. And she did something also that was unusual. I mean, he combined classic European, ballet with the most gut bucket, funky music imaginable, and combined them. My grandmother, on the other side, was a painter of poetry. So she was, she loved poems, and so she did a whole series of more than a dozen poems by A.A. Milne, by Wordsworth, by others, and she would paint the scenes described in the poetry. One is about a swing. How I do like to go up in the air so blue. Oh, I think it's the pleasantest thing that ever a child can do. Up in the air and over the wall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so she painted that. She painted Jack and the Beanstalk. She painted other poems that she would paint for her children, who then passed it on to their children. And my father was also a poet, and was collected. His poetry was collected by Langston Hughes, several poems there. And he also combined these.
Were they published?
Yeah, it was published.
Beautiful.
And
Did you give his name? Your
he passed away.
But what was his name?
Oh, his name was Ernest J. Wilson Jr.
Junior. Okay.
So I'm the third.
You're the third, that's right.
Right. And he was a poet, and some of his poetry was also in the same way that his brother's poetry was inappropriate. And so one of the poems says, "Oh, I went to May's rent party," because back in the Depression, people had to give parties to raise money to pay the rent. And so he's describing one of these parties that he went to, where he said they had liquor and they had pork and they danced this and they danced that, and I just, you can't possibly fail, and I can't wait until May has her next party when they let her out of jail. So again, it's that sort of.
Did everyone have these parties, or is this unique to blacks?
No,
During the Depression.
my hunch is that everybody did,
Because I've never heard of this.
right, but they were, I think, a part of a black culture.
Sure.
Because my father obviously talked about it.
So Ernest, if you would please, where were your grandparents from?
Well, obviously there were two sets.
Mm-hmm.
One set was from Columbia, South Carolina, and that was Ernest Wilson the first, and he was from a large family in South Carolina, and he got married at one point, but he wanted, for some reason that we don't know, he wanted to leave the South. There were stories of, this was the South in probably 1910, something like that. Not a very pleasant place for African Americans, especially people who were upwardly mobile or wanted to be upwardly mobile. But the story is that right after he got married, he went with his new bride to the train station in Columbia, South Carolina. And he got up to the train station and got to the ticket taker and pulled out a stack of money and slammed it down on the counter and said, "Take me this far north."
Get me out of here.
Get me out of here. And so that amount of money took him from Columbia, South Carolina to Greenwich, Connecticut. And that's where they had to get off the train because that's where the ticket. And so he told his new wife, he said, "You wait for me here and I'll be right back and everything will be okay." So they both got off the train. He went inside the train station and she waited outside. And the story goes that he went into the train station and he said, "Where do the colored people live and where do the colored people work?" And the guy was who was in there just going to say, "Just get out of here, just leave me alone." And then he noticed that my grandfather was apparently wearing a Mason ring. And he said, "Are you a Mason?" And my grandfather said, "Yes, sir, I'm a Mason." And then he said, "Well, can you cook?" And my grandfather lied and said, "Oh, I'm a great cook." And so he was hired, apparently, as a cook for the Mason Lodge.
Oh my goodness.
So that's one side of the family.
Do you know much about their time in South Carolina?
I do not.
Okay.
My brother does, though. He's more knowledgeable about that. But I think my grandfather was like the 11th of 12 kids or something like that. Big family. His father's name was Edward. I think his grandfather was a white man who was reported to be a judge. But he'll be able to tell you more about that. Then they went to Philadelphia after being in Connecticut, because I think my grandmother's family, some of them had moved from South Carolina to Philadelphia. And as you know, migration patterns, both with African Americans, but with any immigrant group, they follow their family. And so he followed his family and her family. He became a barber, and then he also worked at the mint. So he raised, as we say, he made millions of dollars, but not his own millions. He went to high school in Philadelphia, one of the leading high schools called Central High School, which was, I'm not sure how integrated it was at that time, but he did go to Central High School and lived in a community that was partially Irish, partially German, partially African American, and kind of grew up in that kind of environment. I mean, my father did, you know. So that's on the Wilson side. And we didn't, for some reason, we didn't go back a lot to South Carolina to visit down there. And I couldn't figure that. I will say, I shouldn't, this is a politically incorrect word, but it was used. And my aunt told me that she asked her mother, which would be my grandmother, why didn't they go back more to South Carolina to visit? And they did a little bit, but she said, why would I want to go back and hang out with those niggas? And so there was obviously something going on there, but we did not hang out much with that side of the family. We did in Philadelphia. We would see their brothers and sisters and their kids. But that's on the Wilson side. On the Gregory side, the family history is that around 1810, there was violence taking place in Madagascar, which is a large island on the east coast of Africa, and had been conquered by the French, by the English, but there had been a lot of dynastic conflict in Madagascar with various tribes and dynasties and families contending for control of the highland in Madagascar. And again, this family history, but I don't know how true it is, but we are told that at one point a Mr. Muhammad wanted to send his son away from this violence and so forth that was taking place in Madagascar, and he wanted to continue his education. And so the son ended up taking a ship to the United States, especially Maryland, the state of Maryland, and settled in the state of Maryland probably around 1920, something like that. And then on the way from the port of Maryland, he went by a house that was sort of off the road and up a hill a little bit, and saw a beautiful woman there. And this beautiful woman attracted his attention. And he went up to the person on whose porch she was sitting or something and said, I want to buy her. And he bought her for $1,200. And that was the beginning of the relationship between the Mohammeds and the family who owned that woman, who was the family of Chief Justice Tawney, who was the one who handed down the Dred Scott decision, which is a pretty horrible decision.
Would you talk about that?
Yeah, well, the Dred Scott decision was a decision that was handed down in the first half of the 19th century by the Supreme Court, and Justice Tawney was the Chief Justice at the time, and it said that African Americans, that black people are property, they are not people. And so they don't have to be treated like people, they just have to be treated like property. And so it was a pretty horrible decision that had impact, across the centuries, literally. So that was, the irony is that, we are related to this African person who could occasionally be called an African prince, but that was probably an exaggeration. But who then married into this white family that was a slave-owning family.
Meaning, I'm sorry, the woman he bought
we think
was white.
was not white.
Was not white.
White because
Right, that's what I was wondering.
because he couldn't buy her
He couldn't, exactly, okay.
if she was white.
Got it, okay.
But he was, Madagascans are they're sort of brownish and reddish
Right,
and so
yeah.
forth. So he then moved inland and set up a shop, or bought a house, created a family that was partially, how can I describe this? Partially into commerce, and was also, and his daughters also entered into commerce, and they set up a health clinic that would provide shock treatment for patients
In Maryland.
in Maryland.
Do we know where?
We do. It's in, I'll think of it in a second,
Okay.
Frederick, Maryland. And so that was the introduction to, and then he had two daughters, and then one of them married my grandmother's older sister. And then my sister, generations later, heard more and more about the Madagascar side. And she, like me and my father, was very interested in Africa and anthropology. And she went to Howard University and studied this. So at one point, over the years, she started going to Frederick, Maryland, and meeting her cousins 5 times removed, and interviewed them. And they cited words in Madagascan and Arabic and so forth. So there was this, and still is, a group of Madagascans that she is in contact with. And then she went to Madagascar and found out that there is a place there called Matavoy or something like that. and she had heard the people in Maryland saying Maravoy, Maravoy, something like that. And it turns out that Maravoy, one of the meanings is a place where crocodiles dwell. And so she was, you know, delightfully astounded to discover that this place that she had heard about when she was there, they said, oh, Maravoy, yeah, we know what that means. That's the place where crocodiles dwell. And so that has started a whole other version of family history where we're trying to come to grips with that. And we got to know Madagascans in Washington. And so I think I mentioned that when I was growing up, and my sister and brother, we met a lot of first generation Africans who were sons and daughters of the ambassadors there. And for some odd reason, we knew the people from Ghana and we knew the people from Senegal, and we also learned the names of the people from Madagascar, the ambassador, the first ambassador. I still remember their name was Rakatomalala. A great name, isn't it? Rakatomalala. So we got to know them, and they got to know and when they found out that my mother was related to people from Madagascar, they would invite us to the...
Because your mother was the daughter of...
My mother was the great-granddaughter
Of Muhammad?
of Muhammad, we think.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
I'm not that good on that side
that's
of it.
Sure.
Oh, there's definitely a Madagascar.
Obviously, yes.
And so my sister went, and she had actually gotten some tattoos of alligators and crocodile, but that was in West Africa for another set of reasons. And then my grandmother's, how can I do this? And again, my brother will know this. One of that offspring of that Madagascan union ended up marrying Booker T. Washington's son. So there is a connection, again, not so much that we are blood related, but there's a community of African American people, and I know this is Malik's, one of his interests, is how did these people know each other? And what kind of life did they live? And then one of their children married, who was on the Booker side, Booker T. Washington side, married Frederick Douglass's, one of Frederick Douglass's offspring. And then he wrote a biography of Frederick Douglass. And so my great-grandfather, great-grandfather and Frederick Douglass were buddies. And
Who was your great-grandfather?
his name was James Monroe Gregory.
Okay.
He was in the first class of Howard University in 1867. And he had planned to go to one of the military academies, but he was selected, but then President Johnson at the time refused to admit him there. So he wrote to my to-be great-grandfather and said, well, if you can't go there, why don't you come to a new university that we are starting called Howard University? Because his name was General Howard,
I see.
who was doing this. And then,
You mean General Howard, who started Howard University?
who started Howard
Yes,
University.
yes.
And
So he ended up at Howard.
he ended up at Howard in the first class. He was one of the first 3 students
Oh my goodness.
in what became Howard University. And then he taught at Howard University, taught classics, and then he sent his first son to Harvard University to study, I think, law or something. And then he sent his second son, who was my grandfather, also to Harvard University. And that son came back to Howard University and taught there also. So he was the second person in the family to teach at Howard University.
But they were both from Harvard, the Harvard graduates.
Yes, well, the father was not,
Yes, yes.
but the second son, but I'm not sure the second son taught at Howard,
I see.
but the
First one.
I mean, the first son, I'm not sure taught there, but the second son, my grandfather, did teach there. And not only taught there, but helped to found the Howard Players, which was the first drama troupe at an African American, at a HBCU. So he founded that with his good friend who had also gone to Howard, Locke. Alain Locke.
Alain Locke, sure.
So they were, and then Locke was a teacher of my father at Howard, and when they got married, and then my father married T.M. Gregory's daughter. That's so. And Alain Locke gave them a copy of the book that he wrote on the Negro Renaissance, Negro art. So there's all the, and then since then, there have been Gregorys at Howard University, I think, since 1867. In fact, one of the young women who was at the party is a current sophomore
Nice.
at Howard University.
What was it like for you growing up in Washington, D.C.?
It's pretty cool.
Can you say something about that? Was where you were born, right?
Yeah.
Which part of the city did you live in?
Well, I was born on Howard University's campus, which is sort of mid city. There was a reservoir right across, down from Howard University.
Still there.
Still there. I grew up on a street called Gresham Place, which is where the reservoir starts. And we lived in a trailer, because it was, after World War II, and so my father had served in Okinawa and came back and was working at Howard University and wanted to study there. So we lived at the bottom of that street, and then later we moved up to the top of that street, also on Gresham Place, which was university housing, and that's where I sort of grew up. There were a lot of, our next door neighbor was the dean of the law school library. And every day I would walk from my house there on Gresham Place to elementary school. That street, where 2 blocks over was a street called Georgia Avenue. Georgia Avenue was the street that Abraham Lincoln would drive on a regular basis to get from the hot White House down in the swamps of Washington, D.C., closer to the University of Maryland, or to where it would be. And so that was a little connection there. And then growing up on Howard University's campus was just a thrill. For a young kid, and I was there till the 5th grade or so, every day I'd get up, leave my house, walk down the alley, past the men's dormitories, and every day I would pass a military cannon. Because again, this was the end of World War II. There was a lot of surplus gear, which I loved because I could wear helmets. I wore helmets and could climb on the cannon. And then at one point, I said, well, whose cannon is this? I was asking somebody at the ROTC building that was there on campus. He said, oh, that's everybody's cannon, which I interpreted as that it's my cannon. And so, I would crawl on it and just have a wonderful time. And then walk to, so the place where I was born, Freedman's Hospital, is on Howard University's campus. So I was born in that hospital on Howard University's campus. And every day would pass it on the way to the elementary school where I went.
Which was off campus? Elementary school?
Or
right next to it?
Right next to it.
Next to it, okay.
Right. So it was like across 6th Street. I mean, it was...
Yeah. Okay, yes.
And so that was exciting. Whenever.
So D.C. was a predominantly black place, right?
I didn't see any white people until I was in the 5th grade. So I was on campus. Everybody I saw, all the teachers, all the professors, all the students, all the MA students were black. And my father participated in that community. His father-in-law taught there. He studied there, got his undergraduate in psychology. At Howard. And what I saw, for me, it was a great blessing because, and there were books around that illustrated this. So I happened to be there at sort of the bellwether of the, right after really, the Harlem Renaissance. And so I saw Haile Selassie, and I saw, Thurgood Marshall, and I saw Alain Locke, who would come to the house, and Congressman Diggs, who would come to the house, and painters who would come to the house.
Why was it called the Harlem Renaissance?
Why?
What was?
Well, it started off with poets and painters and sculptors up in Harlem, New York, which was the black community there. But it spread throughout the East Coast, and especially at Howard University. So my growing up on Howard University's campus was not only a place that I would walk across every day, but I would also walk past my friend's house, the elementary school, the campus dormitories, but I would also walk past Founders Library, which was the largest building on campus, which was like 3 or 4 stories high and was filled with art and intellectual treasures from the Harlem Renaissance and from previous generations. And I would also go to the chapel there, which was called Rankin Chapel. And my sister that's my family chapel. So
I've been there.
You've been there? Oh, isn't it lovely?
Beautiful.
It's just almost unimaginably gorgeous. It's got, as you know, these stained glass windows, but they're stained with not white angels and white Jesus, but black versions of that. And so I would go there.
So sister got married there?
My sister got married there. My father's funeral was held there. My mother's funeral was held there, or service was held there. I got married diagonally across. That's why that African-style wedding.
Oh, that was there?
That not in the chapel, but the chapel was here.
On the campus.
And the what do you call it? The sundial in the middle of the campus was here. Douglas Hall, who was named after my something relative or not relative or something, you know, Frederick Douglass was there. And my grandfather taught right outside that gate there. And then the student undergraduate hall overlooking the water is where Francine and I got married. So Howard, growing up in Washington meant growing up at a place that valued knowledge, that valued commitment to your race, and that valued achievement. And this was not up for discussion. And everybody around was smart and committed and achieving. So when I sort of think back on that, it was the case that my father would come in and tell me, you need to achieve. But it was, more importantly, it was in the water.
Nice.
It was in the water.
And after elementary school, where did you go to junior high?
I went up, this was 1960. Oh, so I went to an elementary school up toward the Washington, Maryland border. A school called Paul Elementary School, which is close to Coolidge High School. It's right down the street from there. So I went there. First time I had seen white students was when I went to John Greenleaf Whittier Elementary School, which was also had on the wall, blessings on thee, little man, barefoot boy with cheek of tan, and thy turned up pantaloon, and thy married whistle to. So that just came with the territory. So I went to Paul Junior High School, which was becoming integrated. That whole area was becoming integrated. When we first moved up to Rittenhouse Street, so DC does that. The west side of the park was the white side of the park. The east side of the park had more black people. But this was also a time when Jews were finally able to move out of their ghettos and move into...
Where were they?
Where were they before? I think...
Were they coming from the cities?
I think they were coming from the city. That's a good question. But I do know that they were trying to get into Chevy Chase and the other side of the
Could
park.
they? Chevy Chase was a total segregation.
Yeah, well, I think they were trying to.
Okay, okay.
I said the emphasis on trying here.
Okay.
And I think that the folks that moved into my neighborhood or I moved into their neighborhood were the ones who either couldn't afford
Yeah.
Chevy Chase and those places over west of the park, or couldn't afford it, or wait, they were not allowed in. And so,
So more Jews were moving into Jewish people were moving into D.C.
from my
From your
perspective,
perspective.
from
Yes,
my
yes,
perspective.
yes,
And one of them created something called Neighbors Incorporated. And it was an early attempt to prevent block busting, which is when real estate agents scare away the white people who are living there to attract either other white people or black people who would be willing to pay more to move into a good neighborhood. And so that block busting was, and so so these Jewish guys, what was his name? Kind of organized a group of Jews and Gentiles and black folks to say, hey, let's protect ourselves. Let's not get sold down the river and pay more money and be segregated. And so that was, in retrospect, extraordinary. And I've heard of very few places in the country.
Because it worked.
Because it really worked. It really worked. And I have, my two best friends went, and so then there's Coolidge High School, which was right nearby, and they had a tennis team, and my very best friend in life is currently a professor at Columbia University. And he and I were in elementary school together, in that walk that I described earlier. And then we were in junior high school together. And he became president of the senior class or something. And then my other friend went to Princeton undergraduate, played tennis, grew up in this same milieu. And the third amongst us was a guy, Steve Good, who his father worked at the State Department. He was appointed ambassador to Zimbabwe or Zambia or something like that. And the four of us loved jazz. I mean, just, and this was when Bohemian Caverns downtown and those places were there, and we would hear Miles Davis and those kind of artists. And that was my growing up.
Was there any, you described these people who became extremely successful. Princeton, ambassador, how did they achieve all that? What do you think?
Because we were told we had to achieve that. And the four of us, Bobby O'Mealy, who just has a new book that's come out with, it describes the Harlem Renaissance, but from the perspective of Toni Morrison and Duke Ellington and a couple of other, very accomplished. Henry was the youngest judge ever at the age of 30 in the Supreme Court. Steve went to Yale undergraduate and then became an art dealer.
Henry, I'm sorry, who? What's the last name?
Henry Kennedy.
became a judge
in Washington, D.C.
of the circuit court? Or the,
Well, first it was just a court.
It was a court, yes, yes, okay. So he became a judge,
He became a judge.
and the other one you just named?
Steve Good.
Okay.
He became an art dealer, especially of early American art, very successful. And so it was the four of us, and you know.
Who were the other? So it was
Bobby
you three and
O'Meally.
the fourth one?
Yeah, Bobby O'Meally went to Stanford,
Okay.
then went to Harvard Graduate School. Henry Kennedy went to Princeton, played tennis. He was a great tennis player along the way, and then went to Harvard Law School. And he and Bobby roomed.
And what did Bobby study?
Bobby studied English.
Who's now at Columbia?
Yes, he was at the event.
Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
my dearest friend.
Yes, yes.
And I did what I did, and then Steve Good did what he did. We're still in contact. I guess I should mention, well, for two things. One is that we were the lucky four, except we weren't lucky. We achieved what we achieved because our parents, especially our fathers, insisted that we be the best. And that being the best didn't mean being stuck up. And all of those parents reached out to people, to young men, especially in the neighborhood, who were not as fortunate as I was, or as Steve was. Bobby's mother was an elementary school teacher in that same elementary school, and went to Miners Teachers College. His father was a cartographer.
College is where?
Right on Howard's
Howard,
campus.
I thought
yeah,
so, okay.
Again, the
Yeah,
Howard
yeah,
campus.
Right, yes.
So we were probably among the most successful in all sorts of ways.
But there were expectations. Am I right?
There were expectations that had to be met. And those were not the same expectations of Boo and Anthony and others who did not succeed, who ended up on drugs or who ended up not going to four-year colleges. And then to make it odder, at one point my father comes back to me in junior high school, because they bought a house out in Silver Spring for $30,000. I remember that. And that's the year that I had to start wearing clothes bought at Value Village. And what's the place where you buy secondhand clothes?
Oh, okay. I know what you mean, like
yeah.
a thrift store.
Well,
No,
yeah.
Kind of like
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes. Okay.
So we started buying stuff there when we moved up to out of the ghetto.
DC was considered a ghetto?
Well, DC wasn't, but Howard University was. So I mean, it was,
Interesting.
when I was growing up, I had black doctors. I went to Howard. I for medical care, I would go to Howard. We would shop in the black community. We would get haircuts in the black community. We would take summer trips up to Annapolis in those areas. So
Going to Silver Springs now, you're in a mixed, is that what?
yeah, that was, so this was not quite up to Silver Spring, but it was close.
Oh, okay.
It was close. It was Manor Park. I mean, it's like, But the other piece that happened is that I was invited by my father to apply for a job at the request of the Chief Justice of the United States.
Which
Earl Warren.
interesting.
So
So he asked your father to ask you to apply for a job.
that's the glorified version. That's the highfalutin version. The other version is that Earl Warren had obviously signed the, the Civil Rights Act. I mean, court decision. He had hired a page boy to go to the page school after that decision came down. That person's father knew my father at Howard University. We also knew a black woman who worked in the typing pool at the Supreme Court. And so for the next 3.5 years, I sat behind Earl Warren and Justice Hugo Black and Justice Douglas, every day, Monday through Thursday, to carry notes back and forth and to ask them questions and get them water or whatever. Did that for 3.5 years.
What was that like? What did you think? What did you feel?
Part of that, I'm going to get to the answer, is that Pages went to a high school called the Page School, which was located on the top floor of the United States Library of Congress. So every day, I would get up at 4:30, get a bus, go down, get off in front of the U.S. Capitol, get out, and then go into the Library of Congress and take a elevator up to the top floor of the Library of Congress, passing the Declaration of Independence and the Gutenberg Bible and so forth, and go to the top floor and study for 3 hours, and then leave there with the other pages and go across the street to the Supreme Court.
How old were you?
15 or 16. And so Page School was like a big deal. I mean, I went to the Supreme Court, 22 other kids went to the U.S. House of Representatives to sit on the floor with the Speaker of the House, and the other 22 went to the U.S. Senate. So every day.
Was this a mixed group?
This was, the school had about 50 kids, 4 at the Supreme Court, 20 at the House, and 15 at the Senate or something like that. But it was all, I was the only black kid there.
That's what I was wondering.
Right.
You're the only one, only
I
black.
think maybe the first year there was another black kid, then there wasn't, and then there was. Mm-hmm. But it definitely was not Coolidge High School. And so over the years, and this sounds like while I was there, I would have lunch every once in a while with the Chief Justice of the United States, or sometimes the poetry consultant of the United States, Stephen Spender, And I just go down and say, hey, Mr. Spender, you know, we go to school up here. Can I have lunch with you? And so we met. I mean, I was introduced into that milieu. It was not typical, but it was not surprising either for my family. You know, because, I mean, Daddy was on the board with Justice Douglas, so that probably helped a little bit. But
what was the board he was on? Do you know?
I think it was something like, you know, Foreign Student Association or something like
yes,
that.
yes.
I mean, it wasn't,
Right.
unfortunately, it wasn't Citibank or
No,
something.
that's right. Sure.
But
What an experience for you as a 15, 16
as a
year old.
15, 16-year-old. And, you know, I met the Kennedys, and I would go to parties with them, and I'd go to the party of the fabulously beautiful daughter of the ambassador from Iran, who had all the guys just like that, because she really was fine. I mean, she was really beautiful. So I started doing
I'm
that.
sorry, is this Zahedi who was the ambassador?
Yeah.
Zahedi? Was that his name? Do you remember? Maybe not. It doesn't matter.
Well, there was Zahedi, who I knew
Maybe
later.
That's right. This is earlier.
Yeah, this
You're
was
right.
this was
Very young,
66, 67.
yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't know. Okay.
But because I was with that page group,
Yes, yes.
and because my father was this, and my father got to be invited to the White House a couple times with my mother when Prime Minister of the UK came, and he and Mom went to that party at the White House, and he also went to parties with Bobby Kennedy, and so I would see them at events, and so in retrospect, this is what my father expected of me. It's not what happened to most kids, either white kids, and certainly not black kids. But for me, and partially because of Howard University, my sister and I started hanging out with the sons and daughters of the ambassador of Ghana and Nigeria and Senegal and Madagascar, etc. You know, and that just, in fact, we had a joke, my sister and I, where, you know, you go out to these events and it says, hello, my name is, and my country is. So we just got tired of being bored, you know, like, you know, boring old Americans, and, you know, who cares about them? So I made up a, hello, my name is Ernest Wilson, and I am from Fusalia. I would put an F in front of the USA and an LIA at the end of it. I said, yes, I'm from Fusalia. They said, Fusalia, where? I said, it's right over. Oh, yes, I know your country. So that was, and then this was a time when a lot of the black Americans who were not able to move up in the civil service, certainly were not able to move into the foreign service, were moving into that neighborhood. And so there was, and I think this again is why, you know, Malik feels the way he does, because these were remarkable people, you know, and they had been discriminated against in the foreign service and in the domestic civil service, and there was a culture there that was hip hop or go-go music, which I loved. I mean, go-go music and Chuck Brown, and I mean, that was just, it couldn't get better. It just couldn't get any better. And my sister and I lucked out to grow up in that rich community where there was both a commitment to the community, including the least amongst us, because both Henry's father and Bobby's father looked out for the young black men who didn't have fathers. That's something that Bobby and I have just talked about recently that I didn't even appreciate.
That was really important, wasn't it?
It was important for everybody. It was important for the kids. I think it was important for our parents because they felt, they're out in the suburbs, having grown up in the hood, and so they felt a little alienated in retrospect. And it was good for us because, Henry, Bobby, and I, we knew that there were other smart kids, smart young black men who didn't have a father who looked out for them. And
Ernest, how would you explain this to an America who doesn't understand?
Now or then?
Yeah.
I think part of what I'm trying to do in the discussions that I have, and I will say that in doing this, memoir thing, I discovered that one of the things I really like to do is help underprivileged kids get into some kind of pipeline. I don't know why, except I've had some people come up and tell me within the past 15, 20 years, he said, I don't know if you know it, but your father took care of me. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when I was out of money, I would go to him and he would make sure I had some money. And so my volunteer work in Africa, in the Congo,
You decided to go to these places and do volunteer work? Or what was it? Would you?
It was that, that maybe makes it a little bit more grandiose.
No, I understand, but just...
But for whatever reason, as an undergraduate at Harvard, 2 summers I volunteered to go to work with the Upward Bound program
Yes.
in Mississippi and Georgia. And then the year after that, I volunteered with something called Volunteer Teachers for Africa. The year after that, I came back. I went to graduate school benefiting from one of these things. And then later, I was asked by somebody at the Ford Foundation, who I think was the first senior Hispanic person at the Ford Foundation. And he said, hey, we have this program, we're trying to get more young people of color to go to the Kennedy School at Harvard and these kind of policy schools, especially for international affairs. Would you help us do that? I said, I don't have tenure. He said, no, this will be really important. And so I agreed to do that and worked with a couple of other folks, and thousands. So the Ford Foundation put money into 5 or 6 different programs. and 4,000, 5,000 kids went through that and went into the State Department and the Defense Department and the CIA and the universities, and worked for the House of Representatives, worked for USAID, and it's still going on.
And you weren't even tenured and gave your time to this, which is a lot of pressure.
I mean, in retrospect, I should have told myself, you dumb sucker, you better not sign up for this. But, for a lot of us, for women and people who come in from other places, if not you, if you don't tell this story, then either it won't be told or it will be told incompletely. And so, there are downsides. I mean, I could be teaching at Harvard. I'm not sure I ever could have done that, or I could have been ambassador to someplace.
No, but yes, you gave your time to a different cause.
Right, and
you're happy about it. I understand.
Right, but
no, but there's.
It's real.
Yes, and so an aspect of what you're speaking about has to do with what we give back, all of us, right? But in your case, we're talking about a very specific community that has always had not open doors and
right.
And so that's even more significant.
Right. And more explicit.
And more explicit.
It's one thing to, I don't know, to be a Protestant, to be a Catholic and say, well, you should go out and help Catholic people.
Right.
Or maybe you should go out and help Iranians, or you should go out and help. But they're kind of a big group. But I do think that there's a curse and a blessing where, and I think it's, I would not have changed anything.
It's interesting that you mentioned a lot of people would tell you your father helped them out, but it seems like the son also did in a different way.
A different way, but a similar way.
Of course.
He helped college kids get privileges they wouldn't otherwise have. And I help college kids with Mexican last names get stuff that they would not have if they didn't go through this program that we're teaching this summer with 350 sons and daughters of migrant workers. And I have no doubt that giving back reflects what my father told me to do and also what I saw him do, which are not always the same thing. But there are people who do, a bunch of the folks who were at the celebration in Washington, they give back, in Gay McDougall. I don't know if you met Gay.
No, but you're now referring to your 50th anniversary.
Yes.
So we have it on record in
Yeah.
Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2022, when all of your wonderful friends gathered together.
Yeah.
And you're saying that some of those people
Do the
also
stuff,
do
yes.
this. Yes.
Do this crazy stuff.
Is this unique to that generation?
This generation is odd because it is what's the word I use? It is ambidextrous. I mean, we were born under segregation. Segregation was bad. Segregation taught us good things. And we can do both of those things. And so, the older, well, yes, I mean, no, we are not the first. The older generation, the first people who went to Howard. There was no historically black college university when they were trying to make their way. And there were, as you'll see in Francile's book, I mean, it's just like generation after generation after generation, giving, with little hope for recompense in a financial or material sense. My generation came along, and it's a thin line. I mean, there are people who are 4 or 5 years older than me who should have gotten more than they did, but I got it. Now, I don't say, but I got it. And they got it. And they didn't get it. Just as smart, just as experienced.
Because of lack of opportunities.
I mean, I was, I also ended up working in the White House and all that stuff. And I saw what networking can do. What's the word for networking in Farsi?
Uh-oh. Irtibatat.
Etabotat. Irtibatat.
Yes, networking is a big deal.
Network, the Chinese have a whole philosophy. It's called guanxi.
Ah, okay.
I mean, guanxi is
networking.
And it has both a good component and like, oh, well, she got it because she was doing echabachi.
Right. So you said there was good segregation, bad segregation. There were good things to learn, bad things to learn. You need to go into more detail about that.
Well, I used, what struck me a lot was in when was that, 2021 or late 1900, and I was in Budapest. Great city. Budapest is just, and so I was there, and it must have been early 90s, I guess, because the wall had just collapsed,
So
been knocked down.
Perhaps, yes.
So that was going on, and it was early. And nobody knew what the hell was going on. I mean, was this a real revolution? Was this a false revolution? Who's winning? Who's losing? And so I was sitting on the Danube between Buda and Pest, and with a couple of guys who had been resistance people, but who had, fought the good fight, and supported the revolutionaries trying to overturn communism. And my recollection of this event is that it was like 3 a.m. and we'd been drinking all night, and one of them looks at me, he says, Ernie, I sure do miss communism.
Exactly.
I said, what do you mean you fought
To get out of
to get out of this? How dare you say that? And then I said, that would be like me saying, oh shit.
You miss segregation, is that right?
And I've subsequently heard that with people from South Africa and from the Belgian Congo, which was like the worst place in the world. But, and of course, nobody wants to go back to apartheid, and nobody wants to go back to racism and segregation, and nobody wants to go back to, well, some people I think want to go back to
that's true.
go back to communism. And I don't know enough about Iran, but anyway, I doubt that there are a lot of people who want to go back to the Shah.
I don't know.
That's not a fair question.
I don't really know anymore.
Yeah. So this part of it is, so I wrote a little note about this and I sent it to the guy he said, look, I know what you're trying to say, but please don't write that because I'll get in trouble. If anybody, it's unlikely anybody will see it, but if they do, if, Vasily Tesavy is the one who is discovered saying he wishes, it wouldn't be good. But there are a couple of essays that have been written about what I miss about segregation. I think it's one of the women who writes for PBS or NPR, I think, has written. But at the end of the day, I mean, we did this. We survived a long time under almost unimaginable conditions. And some of us suffered through that almost all the time. Some people didn't suffer. I mean, there was a black middle class that got its shit together in spite of all of this terrible stuff. And so, going out to Rock Creek Park under segregation, going up to Chesapeake Bay to
What
those.
was that like? Tell me about Rock Creek Park.
Well, it was, and this is sort of the transition period. So it's not Rock Creek Park under slavery.
No, I understand you.
But it's Rock Creek Park when we had something called Jack and Jill, which if you haven't heard a lot about, you should have somebody tell you about something called Jack and Jill, which was a upper middle class mothers association that wanted to raise their kids to be able to expect the good things in life and wanted to prepare their behavior so when they got into these situations, they wouldn't just act a fool, but they would be everything that we would want our children to be when they were young children, young people. And so Jack and Jill was created. This was the third chapter, I think, back there in DC was the third chapter. First was New York. Second was maybe Philadelphia. The third but it was basically a middle class mothers organization. Black. To socialize our black children to know how to get along in a black world and in a white world. I want to say unapologetic. I'll say the mothers were unapologetic. And it was, but as you can imagine, Yes, I miss segregation. No, I don't. Yes, I miss segregation, but I would never want to go back to it. But
it's that sense of community,
yeah,
isn't it?
it is.
Or am I, what is it?
No, it's not. You know, we don't want white people to kick us in. I mean, yes, we want white people to kick us in the ass again. We don't want. We've seen that movie. We don't want to do that again. But there was a kind of both community and commitment, you know, ethical, moral commitment to do the right thing for your people, for your family, for your religion. And I think my friends in Budapest and maybe in China and maybe even here in LA, that, you know, we're missing something. Some of what we used to have, we don't have anymore. And some of that is us, of our generation, but a lot of it is, but some of it is the next generation. And I think it was your brother who was, maybe your sister, who was saying, I mean, it's probably your sister, who said, well, you know, we have these events, and we have dinners, and I tell the young people to come over here and kiss their auntie. And and they want to look at the cell phones. They don't want to kiss auntie, you know.
So the next generation, you're talking about the generation after yours? Well, I'm just trying to...
Yes, maybe a little bit less Malik. I think he's sort of in between.
Okay.
But...
Older than Malik?
Younger
right? Younger
than
than
Malik.
Malik. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I think that...
He's in his 40s.
Right.
Yes, okay. So
Don't say that.
I'm sorry. Younger than Malik. Okay.
Younger than Malik.
I'd like to hear about this. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, you know, we had a great conversation when we were here, when Fran and I were here last time. And I think one of the things we felt was that when walking across campus and running into some black students, they might or may not address you, hello, Professor Wilson, or nod to you as a senior African American on campus where there are not a lot of senior African Americans. So there's some of that in, I don't know if that's Gen Z, I don't know what gen it is anymore. But at the same time, I've been, mostly things that Francine has introduced me to, but recently, some of these kids are now saying, you know, we're not going to put up with this shit anymore. You know, whether it's sexism or whether it is racism or some other kind of ism, they just, you know, they don't want to put up with it anymore. So I think it's not a good idea to tar a whole generation. But, you know, these are weird times. And with any changes in history, Malik keeps giving me these damn books like Budapest in 1900. You know, what am I going to
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Lukács,
yes.
I know.
And I read it. I mean, and you know, I find it even better to have to read some of the other more political types, like Winston Churchill. But what do we tell ourselves? What do you tell yourself? What do you tell your family about the time we are living through? You know, for this country, for Iran, what do we say about Israel?
So, in terms of the younger generation, who didn't experience that period, what are your thoughts about that?
I don't know. Have you spoken with Virgil yet?
Yes. Amazing man.
You know, he grew up under very tough circumstances.
He tried not to sound like it, and I couldn't get him to, but I could imagine, yeah. He actually mentioned the poverty.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And he doesn't say that. Some people would say that. I mean, it's like, well, I've struggled and it's been uphill all the...
Yeah. No, yeah.
But he also is concerned with sequences and phases and so forth. And so I think that's also what keeps me going, is that, you know, we can all look back and say there was a time that everything was bright and shiny and golden and we were all thriving. And we can also all look back and say there were moments, and there are still moments. So I don't know. I don't know what to say about this next gen. I mean, I have been teaching them, but their reactions are odd, my reactions are odd. I don't want to say things are terrible, terrible, terrible to my students, but there are a lot of things I feel are terrible, terrible, terrible.
Can you talk about those? I mean, let's start with race, if it's okay.
Yeah.
If not, it's up to you.
No, I'm not. It's easier for me to say stuff about this generation just because I'm not teaching enough black students now to know what they think. And that's puzzling to me and somewhat unsettling, but it's just the reality of what my life is these days and where I am in my career and what they're looking for, and and trying to find a sense of balance. And I think that, you know, someone like Virgil, who I have a huge amount of respect for, Virgil has single-handedly created a network of black professionals who are engaged in philanthropy. I mean, there's no reason he should have done that. There's no way he could have thought he was going to be as successful, but he did it. And it's still working for us. But I don't know. I mean, it's the stuff that we see with the Supreme Court, the stuff that we see with the political realignments in the South. That's not a good sign. And I can't say that that is the fault of this generation who didn't get their stuff together. It's like, you know, it's like white folks have essentially said, we don't care about y'all, and we don't care. And to the extent that we do care, we're going to try to block your continued ascension in American society. I mean, that's not 100%, but it's higher than I think any of us would have thought 20 years ago. So, I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
I don't want to talk about me. This is not.
I knew you were going to.
But I want to. May I go back to your so Harvard? How was Harvard like? What was it like to be a black student at Harvard in the 1960s, right?
I've been a lucky guy. And my family made me a lucky guy. And I was the fourth generation in my family to be around Harvard. My grandfather, my granduncle, my uncle, and me, the 4 or 5 generations. So what's not to like? I mean, the good side is that I was punched, as they say, to be a member of a society, of a club like they have at Princeton. And, you know, I was a member of that, one of the probably the first in that club. First black guy in the Harvard Lampoon. Wrote for the Crimson. Elected class, not class, but something in that. My uncle was there to invite me to the hasty pudding. It was a gas. And at the same time, you know, I write this about myself, I had just enough segregation growing up to know what it really meant. I had just enough, you know, police opposition to know what that was a real thing. I had just enough bourgeois entitlements to like it, but to know that it's a limiting condition on your life. So that's sort of, and at the same time I was I was at Harvard when, you know, the war in Vietnam was erupting, and when, you know, McNamara and Bundy and those people came to Harvard and told us to shut the F up and mind our P's and Q's. And when SDS was saying that the housing situation in Cambridge, Massachusetts was terrible, and the war in Vietnam was terrible, and there was enough of, Stokely Carmichael and folks who I saw in Boston and in Washington, D.C. So it was like much of my life. On the inside and on the outside, on the downside and on the upside, with all that suggests. It's not a lot I would have changed, except I think I would have selected very wealthy parents if I had to do it over again. But we worked. I mean, the Wilsons, did okay, and that's not, the Harvard thing was so atypical. There were maybe 2 or 3 other, maybe 4 black guys who experienced what I experienced because of their class background, their privilege, their ambition, being light-skinned, being aware of the moment.
How many black students were there?
There were, I think, 50 in my class. And then the numbers shot up. I think the class before that had like 12 or maybe 15. And they had different experiences. Francine in her class, 6.
I know. She mentioned that. What happened after Harvard? So what did you study at Harvard?
I studied getting over.
What?
No, you know that I mean.
Oh, yes.
How to get over.
Get over, yes.
Allegedly government and politics, and all this is in the autobiography.
Yes.
That's pretty straightforward. But I was lucky. I had good mentors. As a black professor who invited me to his home, and
were there many black professors? One. Single professor. Wow. And then what happened after Harvard?
More Harvard.
So you went to graduate school?
No, I mean, I was being
Did
slightly.
you get your PhD?
Yeah, no, what happened was that, again, connections and networks and luck and ability. So the year I graduated was the year of anti-Vietnam protests. Very difficult. The police were coming on campus and beating the students, and I was signed up for my, draft number, which I got a very low number. But then after that, it's like, what's to complain about? So I got out on a health thing, about which the less said, the better. Then the Rockefeller family lost one of its scions, Michael Clark Rockefeller, was a student at Harvard a couple years before me, was traveling around the world, went to Papua New Guinea. Something happened, he got either hit upside the head or the local people ate him up. And they were upset that poor Michael had gotten eaten up by the foreigners. To address that, they created the Michael Clark Rockefeller Fellowship. And the Michael Clark Rockefeller Fellowship selection committee was the family members, his former roommate, and people like, what's his name? And a couple noted professors. So that year I applied for that and I won it. And so they sent me off to Africa, to the Congo. But I was also doing the volunteer teachers, Africa volunteer thing. So I did that for a year and a half.
In the Congo?
The Congo and Ghana and Nigeria and...
What were you doing?
Just what you...
Yeah, you would travel to these places.
Right, so I went to Kenya first, stayed there for a couple of months, interacting with the other Harvard kids who I'd helped set up the thing, and then a buddy and I, who I knew at Harvard, African-American guy, he decided he was going to come with me to the Belgian Congo. So we got on a train, and then we got on a bus, and then we got on a beer truck, and then we went to the Congo border and went from Eastern Congo, Eastern Uganda, is that right? Western Uganda, to the Congo border, got in a bunch of beer trucks that were carrying full and empty beer bottles all up and down the Congo River. Did that, got on the Congo riverboat and went down the Congo River, and then found a way to go into the middle of the Congo, and then did that. Eventually got back in touch with Francine. She had showed up in Ghana with this fetish shrine. She probably didn't tell you too much about that. But it was a group of like 25 to 30 African Americans who were going to the motherland to catch up and so forth. So I did that, and we made pledges, came back to Washington. I worked on Capitol Hill briefly, New York Times briefly, married her, not briefly.
You worked for the New York Times?
I mean, for 20 minutes as a copy boy.
Okay, yeah.
But it was an exciting time to be there.
Of course.
And worked for Charlie Diggs, who was, a mentor to me. And again, Guanxi raises its lovely head. And then we go to California.
You go to Berkeley.
To go to Berkeley,
Right? That's where
That's where I got my PhD, and Francine was working at a women's college, Mills College.
Yes.
And we stayed there for 5 or 6 years, went back to Africa twice, which was great fun. Then decided to move back to the East Coast. Went to the University of Pennsylvania, where I taught, and she was harassed. But just she was a pregnant black woman, who maybe got in because her husband knew the provost, and it was not a pleasant time for us. The good news is one summer we got to go to Aspen, Colorado. which that helped. And then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess we came back to Washington at one point, and we lived up in that, we lived at like Georgia and Peabody or someplace like that, just for a year, and kind of went back and forth. And that's...
And then you ended up at University of Michigan.
Yes, right, that's right. We left Philadelphia, thank God, and which had all sorts of... Philadelphia had issues, not the least of which was Mayor Rizzo, who, remember him, and other terrible things.
Let's talk about that.
We all have to do things in our life that we look back and said, gee, why did we do that? But I had I had not finished my PhD. You know what that's like. You're starting the first year and you haven't finished the PhD and you're trying to get the footnotes. And poor Francine was admitted to the history department where she was treated okay by some people, including Nell Painter, who was her advisor, and not so well by others. Then I met someone at one of the professional associations, as we do, and they said, hey, would you be interested in considering the University of Michigan? And I said, no, I'm an East Coast guy, and who ever heard of Michigan? Football. But they flew me out, flew both of us out, and the usual thing. And what really did it was that there was a group of younger African American scholars who had studied, all the right places, and they had kids our age, and progressive politics, and were willing to get in fights with the administration. And so we were out there till Clinton got elected. It was good and bad and ugly. The good part was we met people who were just lifelong friends, still are our friends. And we learned about quality work, quality scholarship. And I learned about the Midwest. Francine had grown up in the Midwest. I didn't particularly want to learn what I learned in the Midwest. But
it was too rigid. It was too cold. What?
Yeah, I was just grouchy at that point. I was getting depressed. I was being out there, and it was cold, and the family was far away, and my family was deteriorating. Mother and father, and that's never easy. Especially if you don't have all of that stuff that happens in our midlives. But that was also a time when I was learning how to operate in the world. So, that's when I first started working in the World Bank. I did that. That was great fun.
Nice.
And I had what they wanted, and they had what I wanted, and so that was a lot of the time in Ann Arbor. And Rodney was born there, and we had good friends, and it was professionally it was good. Personally, it was good for the most part, but it was ups and downs.
And after that, you went to Maryland?
Yeah, I did a lot of work with, this is when I was doing a lot of work with Russia and with Poland and with Hungary and other, I mean, it's really exciting. And helping them with their work on economic reform. So I was being flown back and forth.
Yeah, this is, now the Soviet Union has collapsed.
Yes, the Soviet
And so
Union.
you're kind of helping these countries.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And the same thing with Poland. I mean, I spent a lot of time helping them with their privatization program and giving them advice. And, you know, it was like, I was young. And I had taught this stuff in graduate school. But actually going out and telling somebody they should give, you know, $1 trillion to these people rather than, you know. So it was good. I mean, it was good. And then we left there. Francine, I think at one point said, look, we've been out here for 9 years. If you want to stay here, then write often. But I am going back to the East Coast. And, you know, I was ready to go back. And she got a good offer at Maryland.
Okay.
And I had sort of, you know, we had kind of traded back and forth who was going to do what and get what. And she had colleagues, you know, who were scholars in her field. And so we couldn't say no to that. I got a couple of offers, one at Maryland and a couple of other New York-y, you know, for, what do you call them, think tanks. And we stayed there till we got the offer to come out here.
How old were you when you started at Harvard?
I was college age.
You were, okay.
No younger, no older.
Okay, I just wondered, yeah.
Yeah, no.
So if there was anything you would want to tell the younger black generation, what would it be?
Quincy says something to me when I write, Coco Sol, keep on keeping on. I'll have to get the end of it.
Okay.
But I would sort of say that, keep on keeping on. I would say that, because, you know, Rodney and I are,
Your son, right, okay.
is, we're working on something with William Morris Endeavor, which is the big talent company. It's like CAA and WME are the two biggest in town. And we are working with, they're trying to, like everybody else, they're trying to get more colored people into their ranks, and so they're recruiting, but then they're finding that when they recruit, the people leave. And so they've hired us to help try to fix that. And so that continues. So so this is a question that I'm literally that I'm asking them, but also these young kids, you know, young Hispanic kids, sons and daughters of migrant workers, trying to, you know, tell them to hang in there, that things are better than they have been. I mean, in jobs, in employment, especially if you graduate from the University of Southern California. You know, it's like the graduates of the school, of the school that I used to run, like 97% of the kids who graduate are employed. So, but it's tough. I mean, the experiences I had were so very different from what they seem to be having now.
How so? Can you, what is it?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's sort of like the opportunities are there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The mistreatment continues to be there.
Mm.
If you bust your ass, you can be Denzel Washington, or one of the other stars, because I've keep on keeping on.
So
I mean,
there's still a lot of, there's just not general acceptance. It's racism. Is that, I mean, I'd like to, am I right? It's racism. It's just, okay.
And it's horrible. You look at what is happening in the state of Georgia. I mean, what the conservative Republicans, I think, have decided, the leadership has said, we detest these cultural reactions that we're seeing among you black people. It's nasty. It is unsafe. It is un-American. And we're going to do everything to stop you. I mean, that's not all white people, but the ones who feel that way are being pretty explicit and trying to reverse, 50 years of progress.
Can you be more specific? What are they?
Well, making it more difficult to vote.
To vote, okay.
More difficult to get enrolled to vote. More difficult to get financial aid. More difficult to address issues that we see are obvious. I mean, I think most African Americans, about structural inequalities.
Housing, health, education, okay.
I mean, the numbers are not good.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can find some examples that are where things are better.
Mm-hmm.
But as I'm sure Virgil will tell you, it's not looking good in terms of these structural issues. And I think what I hear white opposition saying is, yeah, I see y'all are kind of screwed up and you don't have as much money as we do, you don't have as much wealth as we do, but we're going to keep ours and we're not going to share. And our generation has spent a generation saying share and so forth, and then we hit moments where there are reactions. Bull Connor and all those folks back in the real segregation days. But the stuff I read coming across my screen seems to talk about going backwards.